Good afternoon. Welcome to today's energy seminar. This is our first seminar of the quarter. We got a fantastic speaker to kick us off today. I would first like, though, because this is the first seminar of the quarter, introduce the team that produces the energy seminar each and every Monday this quarter, and that would include Professor William Chu, the director of the Precourt Institute for Energy, who's in material science, who I just talked to, who's not going to be here today, but will be here throughout the quarter. He sponsors and supports the energy seminar. Then myself, John Wyant, I'm in management science and engineering and energy science and engineering, a few other things, and I am the faculty director of the energy seminar. And then in the back, you probably already Rachel Madison, who's been trying to get you to move up closer to the speaker, who's the Precourt Institute for Energy program manager. And last but not least, you've already heard from Noelle Eveland, who's a joint MBA Energy and Resources Master's student here through the Door School. So we usually try to have an august speaker who knows the field very well to introduce each speaker, and we lucked out this week in that our old friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Salzer, who's the managing director of the Stanford Center for Carbon Storage and a whole bunch of other things related to that, from reservoir simulation to energy systems modeling, and a great colleague for all of us at Precourt, including myself, is here today to introduce our speaker, Tim Dixon. So without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to Sarah. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, John. Okay. Hi, everyone. Okay, it's great to be here today, but I'm really more enthusiastic to introduce our speaker today, who I think is a great first speaker for the seminar series this quarter. So Tim Dixon is the director and general manager of the IEAGHG, as you can see on his slide there. So that acronym stands for the International Energy Agency Greenhouse Gas R&D Program. And basically, it's a research organization focusing on carbon capture and storage. He is responsible for delivering the evidence base on CCS to members and to the wider stakeholders. He has extensive experience representing CCS in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the UN entity that's tasked with supporting the global response to the threat of climate change. He's also a director on the board for the International CCS Knowledge Centre, which is in Canada, and an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Texas, an Honorary Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and he chairs or sits on many advisory committees dealing with CCS projects all around the globe. He has a bachelor's in applied physics and also an MBA. He's a fellow of the Energy Institute, which is a UK organization, a member of the Institute of Physics, and the UK Environmental Law Association. Outside of work, as you can guess, he's passionate about mitigating climate change, giving talks to schools and civil society, and an active wildlife conservationist. And most importantly, he's an active runner. He's a very serious runner. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Tim for today's talk. And do you have a mic? You're mic'd up? Great.
Okay, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Thank you, John, for the invite, and thank you, Sarah, very much for the invite to speak to you today. It's taking advantage of being in the region for another workshop activity. So yes, I'm the head of IEAGHG. We're an international research organisation. I'll say a little bit about us at the start, but the reason I'm giving this talk is because I've had some experience in UK government, and I've also been on the research side of the fence, generating information that feeds into policy and regulatory developments. So the title is Carbon Management Technologies, and by that I mean carbon capture and storage and engineered carbon dioxide removal. So this is a fairly recent use of this term, carbon management, but it's those two engineered solutions to CO2 emissions is what I'm talking about. And they're relatively recent in terms of technologies. So the way they've been dealt with in global climate policy is quite interesting as an example of a new suite of technologies coming in. And we're going to see more of this to come in the future with other technologies like geoengineering especially. So I want to give you the perspectives from both the government side being involved in the international regulatory developments, and then from the research side as well. So my my next slide is our standard disclaimer. Yes, we were set up by the International Energy Agency, but we are not them, and anything I say does not count as their views. We are autonomous from them, but we do use their material and they use our material. But we're not policy prescriptive. They take our work and develop their policy messages potentially as a result. And this is us. This is what we do. We're an international research organisation. We're funded by 39 countries and companies, about half and half in our membership. Many of the countries of developing countries, and most of the companies are the big energy multinationals. And we fund research into the development and deployment of carbon capture and storage, and increasingly on engineered carbon dioxide removal technologies. So we've produced over our 34-year history, we've produced over 400 reports on all different aspects of CCS. We run international expert networks in different aspects of CCS. And we run the largest conference on CCS, which is the GHGT series. And we've held these every 2 years. The last one was in Calgary in October, and we had 1,547 attendees. That was the largest one we've had yet. And that also means that was the largest gathering of CCS people ever. Our next conference is on post-combustion capture. That's in France in September. And the call for abstracts is closing, I think, today or tomorrow. We also run the main international summer school on CCS. We've held 16 of these. We rotate them around the world. And this year it's going to be in Canada. And with all of this work, we provide input into UNFCCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, London Convention, and other fora such as that. And I'll talk about a couple of those in this talk. So before I get into the meat of it, can I just ask for a show of hands, students who are involved in energy or engineering? Can you put your hands up? Great. Students who are involved more in policy and law, can you put your hands up? Okay, so this talk's going to be more towards the policy and regulatory side. So I hope you all get something from it. But it's an interesting evolution of all of these things with this technology moving in, because people have only really been talking about CCS for the last 20 years. And in case you're not familiar with it, apologies to those of you who are, this cartoon says what carbon capture and storage is about. It's capturing carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, from large point sources, stopping it from being emitted into the atmosphere and injecting it deep beneath the ground. So point sources such as power stations that can be run on fossil fuels or biomass, in which case it's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is a negative emission technology, gas processing, heavy industry, hard to abate sectors like cement production, iron and steel, chemical industries, and even capturing it directly from the air through direct air capture and injecting it deep beneath the ground. So the one thing wrong with this cartoon is the scale of the geological storage. And this is a scale of a project in Canada, because we inject the carbon dioxide at least 800 meters deep. That's half a mile deep. And that's because the pressure increases the deeper you go. And at that depth, generally, it goes into a dense phase. So you get more of it into the pore space in the geology. This one example here is a coal power station in Canada, and that's 3,000 meters deep, nearly 2 miles deep. And it shows a different strata that trap the CO2 down there. And as the IPCC diagram there shows, the different mechanisms that take place trap the CO2 and make it more secure the longer it is in the subsurface. So that's good. Stuff works in our favour in that sense. But why are we looking at carbon capture and storage? Because it's a cost to put it onto any large point source of CO2. Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that's the main science body that inputs to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And every 7 years, they do their assessment reports, putting together the latest science on climate change, on mitigation activities, and on impacts of climate change. And the most recent series of reports was from AR6. And in every mitigation pathway limiting global warming to 1.5 or to 2 degrees, they have lots of everything in their mitigation technologies and means, but also a significant amount of CO2 geological storage through carbon capture and storage and engineered CDR as well, in all of the mitigation pathways to achieve those limits on global warming. They also observed that the capacity for geological storage on the planet greatly exceeds the needs of the role of CCS in this, using all of the mitigation options. So there's more than enough storage space, but there's a gap in the policy world. There's not enough policy instruments to encourage the deployment of projects. So my colleagues at the International Energy Agency produced their nice charts and graphs and good reports on CCS. I like their report from 2020 because it summarizes neatly why we're looking at this technology. And that's 4 points. Firstly, you can bolt it onto existing plant. You can put it onto existing energy assets. You can retrofit it. You don't have to rebuild an infrastructure. Secondly, you can deal with the hard to abate sectors in heavy industry, such as cement and others. Thirdly, it's a route to developing lower cost, low carbon hydrogen. And fourthly, yes, you can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So ready for the UNFCCC meeting in Glasgow in 2021, the IEA developed a roadmap for the energy sector, because the energy sector is the biggest contributor of CO2 to global warming, for the role of the energy sector to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And this roadmap is it's an example rather than a pathway. It's got lots of everything in there, but importantly at 2035, it's got 4 gigatons of CO2 captured and stored. That's 4,000 million tons. That's 100 times more than we're doing at the moment. So that's saying a big scale up is needed of carbon capture and storage projects. 2 years later, they updated that roadmap, and the bad news, or the good news is, in the top right figure here, whereas the carbon capture and storage projects have been fairly on a plateau for some years, the pipeline of projects being assessed and developed, or even in construction, is accelerating upwards. So that's good. The bad news in the bottom right figure there, that even if all those projects being assessed are realised and built and operated, they're still only going to contribute 1/3 of what's needed of the CCS role in that net zero roadmap. So because we're not doing enough, the previous US administration launched a carbon management challenge. So this is a government-to-government initiative launched in 2023 and formally launched at the UNFCCC COP in Dubai, COP28. And this is to encourage countries to scale up carbon capture and storage and engineered CDR up to a gigaton scale by 2030. What's significant more about this, apart from it being launched at a COP, UNFCCC COP, is that in the 5 lead countries, you've got the leading CCS countries you would expect, the US, Canada and UK, but also Indonesia and Brazil, 2 developing economies, saying that this is the right technology for them to decarbonise parts of their economy as well. So let's move to the UNFCCC. As described by Sarah, this is the overall global treaty trying to tackle climate change. It's nearly as old as IEAGHG, actually. We're 1 year older than this. We worked under the first part of this really was the Kyoto Protocol, where developed countries took on emissions targets. Developing countries did not, but developing countries had a mechanism to get funding for low carbon projects called the Clean Development Mechanism, which generated carbon credits for low carbon projects that could be used by the developed countries against their emissions targets. And in 2011, CCS was accepted into the Clean Development Mechanism after 5 years of negotiations and work. And that was important because it set a precedent. Yes, it's okay for developing countries to use. Here's a default regulatory framework, and any future mechanisms, large financial climate finance mechanisms, can use the same rules and procedures for ensuring that it's done correctly. But of course, that was the Kyoto Protocol. We're not under that now. We're now under the Paris Agreement that was agreed in 2015. And here the political targets are to limit warming to well below 2 degrees by the end of the century, and try and pursue limiting it to 1.5 degrees, and to achieve net zero at some point in the second half of the century, but that's now read to be mid-century. And the Paris Agreement works by all countries taking on emissions reductions targets, but they get to choose them for themselves, and they're expressed through their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs. And these have to be updated every 5 years, and they have to represent a progression of mitigation on from the previous one for that country. But it's important to point out countries decide these for themselves. They're not dictated to them. And the second part of the Paris Agreement is to look further to the mid-century with these long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. And in terms of these two parts of the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, first of all, the first 2 tranches of these were just looking to 2030. So it's not that surprising that only 25 countries out of the 197 had CCS in them, because CCS projects take time to build and there's other things you can do in the meantime. But in the third update of these, which is current and it's due now, and they're looking to 2035, countries are realizing they've done all the easy to do mitigation in their first and second NDCs. They've got to go beyond those. So they really do have to deal with the hard to abate CO2 emissions in their economies. And so those that have been submitted, most of them have got CCS in now. And the same principle follows with these low greenhouse gas emission development strategies to the mid-century. These are looking beyond the political horizons of most governments. And again, the governments are realizing they've put the easy to do stuff in their NDCs. They've got to go beyond those. So 2/3 of those have got CCS in. And those that haven't are generally countries that don't have large point sources of CCS, of CO2. So jumping forwards then, in these UNFCCC COPs, a really significant one 2 years ago was COP28 in Dubai, and it was called the Global Stocktake. And it was the first stocktake, basically an assessment of how countries are doing against the Paris Agreement objectives, and taking in the IPCC's AR6 outputs as an important measure and going in. And as you might imagine, yes, we're not reducing greenhouse gas emissions fast enough. There's an implementation gap, as they called it. We're really not on the path to limiting warming to those targets. We've already emitted 4/5 of the carbon budget if we're going to limit warming to 1.5. So we really need to do deep and rapid emissions reductions more than we are at the moment. So their overall outcome text, it gets a heading generally from these COPs. They call this one the UAE consensus. And because of these conclusions, the actions then, it calls upon parties, calls upon countries to do several things: tripling renewables, doubling energy efficiency, accelerating the phase down of unabated coal. That means coal without carbon capture on it. But for the first time ever, an explicit mention of fossil fuels, transitioning from fossil fuels in energy systems so as to achieve net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. And that's an acknowledgement to the IPCC pathways. And also for the first time, an explicit mention of carbon capture and storage as well. So those were positive outcomes, as positive as you can get from a UNFCCC process and mechanism, where you have to have all the 197 countries agreeing. It's consensus based upon that. So to get this out was significant. So just to go back a couple of COPs before that, the one bit of the Paris Agreement that wasn't finalised before this point was the Article 6, which is about international cooperation. And this is important because this is the sort of principles that countries can do activities in another country that may be at lower cost and reduce more CO2 emissions than doing it in their own countries, but they need a means of getting recognition in terms of carbon credits or carbon markets for doing these projects, so that those carbon credits can be recognised against their NDCs, or if they're companies, against those company targets. And so 2 mechanisms were created under this Paris Agreement, Article 6. Article 6.2 is a country-to-country agreement. So 2 governments agree to fund activities in one country, share the emissions reductions between them, or whatever they decide upon. And Article 6.4 is a project-based mechanism, like the Clean Development Mechanism, but across all countries. So this sets in place the frameworks for international carbon markets. And if you're into carbon markets, you know there's 2 types. There's the compliance carbon markets, which are regulated by some authority, and there's the voluntary carbon markets, which are self-regulated. This puts in place the framework for international carbon markets. They're technology neutral in these framework texts, but also this COP set up for the 6.4 mechanism, because the private sector is going to be very much involved in these projects, set up a supervisory body to develop the governance and also to do the governance of this mechanism. And they actually also asked this supervisory body to look at removals, specifically that's processes to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So the supervisory body spent 2 years of quite intense work looking at removals, because removals is broader in their scope, broader than just the engineered removals of direct air capture and BECCS. It includes nature-based solutions as well, afforestation, reforestation. That's really broad, and there's differences, substantial differences in these, for example, around permanence, because CO2 geological storage, if it's done correctly, is generally regarded as permanent in terms of climate context. But afforestation, reforestation, soil use management techniques can change, forests can burn down, much less permanent. How do you accommodate all of those in the same mechanism? Because what's important in carbon accounting mechanisms is if you've got a reward for stopping an emission, and then there is an emission from your project activity, such as a leak, or the term here is reversal of this removal, then that has to be accounted for so that you maintain the integrity of the accounting system. What they also realise is that CCS should be included in this as well, because that's an emission reduction, not a removal, but an emission reduction with a risk of reversals, because in theory you can get leakage from your geological storage. So they put in place in their what they called the standard on removals, which they approved in October last year, various requirements such as requirement for monitoring plans for all of the suite of technologies and means of doing this. Certain, how do you work out for how long post-project, post-crediting you have monitoring and reporting for? In terms of if there is a reversal, you have a risk assessment tool for assessing that. And if there is a reversal, they're going to create a buffer pool of these credits, the carbon credits, to be drawn upon. And each project's got to input a percentage of credits into that buffer pool, and the percentage will depend upon the risk of that project having a reversal. So you can imagine that engineered geological storage removals would have lower contributions, and nature-based ones such as afforestation and reforestation would have to contribute more. So this is now a standard on removals. They also issued a standard on methodologies as well. And this is in place, and this was then approved at the following COP in November, COP29 in Baku. So it became operationalized, and they gave it a new acronym, because UNFCCC is a very acronym-laden world, and it's now called the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism, PACM. So that's in place for project-based activities, and Article 6.2 happens through bilateral agreements between countries. So that was already ineffectively operationalized, but they developed some further guidance on that as well. So that was a positive outcome of that COP, which didn't achieve objectives as great as other people wanted in other areas, specifically finance. But I thought I'd give you a flavour of these COPs as well, because this is where international climate policies discussed and evolves and is agreed at these. But they're very rich environments, very dynamic environments in terms of all the different interests that are represented there. So these are meetings of 197 countries. And there's a lot of different perspectives on all of the different topics covered at these COPs. So you do get civil society in the COPs. They're formally allowed. In fact, they're put into groups, into constituencies. So you have, and the UNFCCC gives them a chance to speak in plenary, but they don't sit at the table in the negotiations. So we have constituencies of the environmental NGOs, youth NGOs, business and industry NGOs, trade union NGOs, etc., etc. And so in some frustration, some of these groups have protest activities at the COPs. The one on the top right is in a national negotiation room. That's very much frowned upon. If you do go to a COP, don't do it in a formal UNFCCC meeting. All those people would have had their badges. They would have been expelled from the COP and had their badges removed. There is protest outside. The one in the middle at the bottom is a 100,000 person march through the streets of Glasgow in COP 26. Bottom right is lobbying against fossil fuel companies being in the COPs. Bottom left, that inflatable polar bear is actually the nuclear power industry advocating for nuclear power, more nuclear power. And the most interesting one here, I think, is the top right photograph. And Climate Action Network is a group of environmental NGOs at the COPs who every day announce a Fossil of the Day award. And it's to name and shame the countries doing the worst in the negotiations. And they have a person dressed up in a Tyrannosaurus Rex suit, and they introduce it by singing the theme tune of Jurassic Park, and they call out the worst countries on that day at 5:30 every day in the 2-week COP. And that's the leaderboard on the right. So some countries don't care, but some countries really do care and don't want to be seen on that leaderboard, particularly European countries. I think it's quite a good way of immediate feedback on the negotiations actually in the COPs. But specifically the COP28 in Dubai, I think because it was a petro-state and the presidency of the COP was also the CEO of the national oil company, there was a lot more disinformation about CCS at this COP. And these are examples from that one COP, showing articles in The Guardian, showing there's carbon capture lobbyists there, 475. Well, if it's meant to carbon capture in the IEA's scenarios is meant to be 8 or 10% of the mitigation activities, that means with 100,000 people there, that was massively underrepresented as a technology in the COP. And that's too simplistic an assessment, really. And the bottom right one is a wrap that Climate Action Network put in their daily newsletter. It's a wrap about the Carbon Management Challenge. It's quite a good rap. I'm not going to sing it to you because you don't want to hear me sing. It's quite funny, it's quite nice. It's just a shame it's about a serious subject. So at the COPs, what we do as IEAGHG, working with the University of Texas, is we organise the main official side event, UNFCCC side event on carbon capture and storage. We've done that for the last 10 COPs. And that reaches out to a wide audience because the UNFCCC promote it for us there. And that was just the example from that COP. And we had Brad Crabtree, the Assistant Secretary from DOE, giving the welcome to that as well. And then in the other side events at COPs, we try and encourage developing countries to share, to do this South-South cooperation. And this example was specifically on CCS in small island developing states. And we had Trinidad and Tobago showing what they were doing with Guyana and showing that again with Timor-Leste. Also, just further examples of reaching outside of the CCS silo or CCS bubble. I'm very proud I got invited in the top right there to speak in a Youngos event, Youth NGOs event. There's a round table thing where everyone got to share their perspectives. We have an information booth at COPs as well. That's the top right picture. That's constantly busy. People hungry for information on carbon capture and storage. And when you're trying to describe it to people, particularly on the storage side. In this case, the middle photograph was quite useful. In Dubai has the world's tallest building, the Burj Khalifa, 800 meters high. So you just tell people, think of that building and invert it. That's how the minimum depth we inject CO2 to. So that helps people understand. So I think it's important to reach out to all the different civil society groups at the COPs and to counter any disinformation. So in the last 10 minutes, I'll move on to a different international treaty. And this is one that concerns protection of the world's seas. And it's the London Convention and the London Protocol. They're used interchangeably because the London Protocol is replaced in the Convention, but they meet together. It's the same meetings, same people, etc., etc. And it's a really good treaty. It stopped the dumping of industrial wastes at sea. Got 87 countries in the London Convention now, 54 countries in the London Protocol, and it prohibits dumping of things unless they're on a positive list. And if they are on that list, there's got to be a permitting requirement to do an environmental protection assessment for any of those before they're put into the marine environment. So that's good, and it's worked. However, putting CO2 beneath the seabed, deep in the geology, counts as being in the marine environment. So it stopped carbon capture and storage projects doing offshore geological storage. And many countries want to do that because we've got good geology offshore, such as in the North Sea in Europe. So after some consideration by their scientific group in the London Convention, they realised that this could be done. They produced a risk assessment framework and then voted for an amendment to add CO2 geological storage to that list of things you can put in the marine environment, and developed a set of specific guidelines for CCS called the CO2 specific guidelines. And that's guidance to both the regulator in what to ask for and look for, and to the operators in what to put into their permit applications. And it's basically around risk assessment, environmental impact assessment, monitoring and mitigation plans. So that's all good. But that moved relatively quickly for a large international treaty. And this is an old slide from 2005, but I don't apologise for using it. It's from Plymouth Marine Laboratories, because in the scientific group's work, in looking at the impact, should there be leakage from the geology of some CO2 into the marine environment, they realised the impact of the increased CO2 in the atmosphere, because we've been emitting it and it's absorbed by the surface layers of the oceans, and we're acidifying the surface layers of the oceans. And already at that point, we'd moved where the oceans have been for 20 million years beyond that, making them more acidic. And when this work was done, it was about 390 parts per million, and we're now at 423 parts per million. And we haven't got to go much further, 500, 550 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, and we'll change the seawater chemistry significantly such that phytoplankton, such as that coccolithophore, won't be able to form their calcium carbonate bodies. And if you take out phytoplankton from the marine systems, you really, really have messed up the oceans. And this made them work sooner and harder in this. What could they do? Well, there's one low carbon technology asking for this amendment, so they probably move quicker because of this as a result. And just if you're wondering about my shirt, this is the year of my birth. This was the parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere, 318, and we're now 423. This is how bad we've been. So we need to do more. So that was all good. The one bit that didn't get fixed then was an important part of the London Convention. Its own Article 6 is to do with export or stopping export of wastes as a backdoor route to send them to a country that's not a party for dumping in their sea. So it's a good thing, but it also stops the export of CO2 for geological storage. So in 2009, the Norwegians sort of led on an amendment that was voted and approved to allow export of CO2 for geological storage, with several requirements in there. There has to be a bilateral agreement or arrangement between the countries. It's got to be very clear about who's responsible for the permitting the different aspects and meeting the CO2 specific guidelines. And also, really importantly, if you're exporting to a country that's not in the London Protocol, the exporting country's got to demonstrate the receiving country is going to meet the requirements of the London Protocol. And they've got to submit all this information to the Secretariat, which is the International Maritime Organization, the IMO. The only thing with this amendment, it's in the body text, not an annex, it's in the body text of the London Protocol. So to come into force, it's got to be ratified by 2/3 of the countries. Well, after 10 years, only 6 countries had ratified it. So, for international lawyers here in the room, they drew upon the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties and decided that there was a mechanism called a provisional application could be proposed of this 2009 export amendment. So Norway, helped by Netherlands, proposed this in 2019. We're in these meetings as IEAGHG. We're the only CCS organisation in the room. And these meetings, they're UN, under the UN framework, but they're different to the UNFCCC, where the NGOs sit outside the negotiations, shouting in. In the London Protocol, NGOs sit at the table in the negotiations, in the drafting. And that's important to know, because whilst that photo is not meant to be just showing the back of my head, but on the right-hand side of me is Greenpeace. And they're very active in there, and they have different opinions on CCS. And so we're there providing evidence base. We work together brilliantly. We've worked together with them for 20 years here. We have different opinions on CCS, but then we have lunch together at the same time. It's a much more conducive environment, I think, than the UNFCCC, which is more shouty and disagreements and things. So just to wrap up, because I've shown you lots of text. That's our report that on the summarising, drawing out the information for export of CO2. The reason the Norwegians wanted to have this amendment, within a month of that 2019 agreement, the Norwegian government pressed a green light on the funding for the Northern Lights project. This is a really important CCS project. It's a storage facility offshore with an onshore receiving facility for taking CO2 by ships from other countries. So they're going to provide CO2 storage as a service. And this slide from 2019 showed the 7 MOUs they had in place. I was fortunate to visit it last month. Behind me in the photograph is the first CO2 carrier ship moored up, testing its discharging equipment. That tall mast thing is a Flitner rotor sail that provides wind assistance for travelling. It's a low carbon ship. And what I was pleased to hear is of those 7 MOUs, 3 are now in contract from a cement plant in Norway, from a fertiliser plant in the Netherlands, and from a bioenergy plant in Denmark. Everything's built and ready to go, and the first CO2 will start being captured and shipped this year. And as well as these, there's 30 more expressions of interest. So this project, the Northern Lights project, has enabled the decarbonisation of many CO2 sources across Northern Europe. I was in Japan 2 weeks ago. They're developing the feasibility of their large-scale CCS projects, 9 projects. 4 of those, they don't have enough geology for all their CO2 from their coal power stations and so on. 4 of those projects are planning to export CO2 by ship, 3 of them to Malaysia. Malaysia is not a party to the London Protocol, so this will be the first case of Japan demonstrating that Malaysia's got the regulations in place for the environmental protection of offshore geological storage. Last week, Malaysia passed its regulations bill in Parliament to enable that. And lastly, a small island state, Timor-Leste, relatively new. Its main income as a country was a big natural gas field offshore with a pipeline direct to Darwin, Australia for LNG, natural gas to an LNG facility. That gas field is just about depleted. That's their main income as a country ending. But the LNG facility operators can get natural gas from elsewhere, and they're developing more LNG there, and they want to capture the CO2. And the Timor-Lesteans say, we can take that back. We can take the CO2 on the same pipeline, 300 miles, and store it in the depleted gas field. And the World Bank's putting money into Timor-Leste to help them build their capacity to regulate and operate that safely. And there's just some photos of projects to show that we do have projects. There are CCS projects at large scale around the world, Sleipner in the North Sea, Boundary Dam in Canada, Quest in Canada as well. The capture side can look quite large. The storage side is generally a well that size because all of the storage happens beneath the surface. Do we have enough projects? Well, my friends at the Global CCS Institute produce their global status report every year. That shows there's a lot of projects being developed in North America, large-scale projects, and in Europe. The good news is the project pipeline is increasing. The year before, there was 41 projects in operation. When they published this, there's 50. There's now 65. But that's still not enough. And so my colleagues at the International Energy Agency are keeping track of the Dubai COP outcomes for the energy sector, mapping all the technologies being deployed. And they reckon now that if all the CCS projects are built and operated, that still will only be 40% of what's expected in their net zero roadmap for the energy sector. So that's a quick run through of all of that. The awareness is increasing by governments of the need for CCS, as we're seeing in the updated NDCs. The Carbon Management Challenge is an indicator of that as well. We're not developing and deploying and building enough projects. That's a matter of concern. But the transboundary developments of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and the London Protocol should enable countries, particularly if they don't have the right geology, to do CCS for their big point sources of CO2. So with that, thank you very much and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. I don't know if this is on, but we're going to move to the Q&A portion of this seminar now. So I'd like to start actually, if there are any students in the audience that have a question, we'd like to make sure we get to your questions first. So raise your hands. Yes, over here.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So in one of the slides you showed the distribution of CCS projects, and I think they show that most of them are in US, or many of them are in US. And US has been providing incentives for CCS projects for a long time. The 45Q tax credit and the So do we think that after the CCS is included in Article 6 and the incentives are transferred to the developing countries, so will that be a strong enough incentive in a developing country compared to that in the US? So that the deployment increases to other areas.
Okay, good question. So generally, other countries look to the US and 45Q with envy because they think it's a really good and stable incentive mechanism because it's fixed price. It's not like the carbon markets where the price is very variable, can be variable, such as we see with the EU emissions trading scheme. So it's got a certainty in the price value. The big question is what price will be the credits that are generated from the Article 6 mechanisms? And we just don't know that yet. It depends who the buyers are going to be and looking at their country's mitigation activities and the cost curves of doing activities in their country against doing activities in other countries. So we just don't know at the moment. Under the Clean Development Mechanism, the main buyer of those credits was the countries in the European Union. So the prices of those credits were very much determined by the price of the EU ETS in Europe. Europe now is saying it's not going to take in external credits, certainly at the moment. So we don't know who the main buyers are going to be. So we just don't have a feel yet. All we know is that the framework is in place for the credits to be formally recognised and moved between countries. But we don't know if it's going to be enough.
Other questions?
Thanks very much for the presentation. I was hoping that you could give some color as to your thoughts on how the current presidential administration will affect the trajectory of CCS development in the US, as well as other geoengineering technologies.
So CCS in particular has been characterized by having bipartisan support over many administrations here in the US, to both parties' credit. I really don't know what's going to happen now because there's quite a high level of unpredictability in the current policies. and executive orders that are coming out and so on. And the direct air capture projects I've seen in the news recently, there's some concern about the 2 large DAC hubs, whether they will continue. I mean, all this is to be, there's a high level of uncertainty in general on this. Trump has indicated that he will leave the Paris Agreement again. He left it last time. You have to give a year's notice before leaving. Whether that makes a difference to other countries, people think that other countries will step up. Certainly the talk is that at the moment in terms of climate action. Generally, Europe, people are thinking that China will really step up as well because they see the impacts in their country to their economy of climate change, and they may take over the lead there as well. But we just don't know. But I think the CCS expertise, the best country in the world is the US, with all the different research institutes and the projects and the companies that are based here. So I really hope that all that continues under this administration, but high levels of uncertainty at the moment. And I welcome anybody else's opinion on that.
I can add that Steve Winberg, who is an appointee of Trump to the Department of Energy, he's the Undersecretary for, I think it's infrastructure. I may have his title somewhat wrong. He did speak at a conference in early February. And he did say that the United States is a leader, has always been a leader in CCS, and we plan to continue that leadership. That's the only quote I have. Okay.
So fingers crossed on that.
Yeah.
And I did see in the news just yesterday that there's a proposed bill, the 45Q repeal bill, from Scott Perry, is it the Senate in Pennsylvania. So I don't know how that's going to go, because I think there's still bipartisan support for 45Q. And a lot of that money goes to the red states, not the blue states. So, let's hope that bipartisan support continues.
Other questions? Student?
Thank you so much, first of all. And I have a question about, sorry. Yeah. Thank you. I have a question about the, public perceptions of the projects, because as you said, there's not enough number of the projects and each country has some goals. And as a state, California has a goal to capture 125 million tons of carbon dioxide by 2045. And imagining that, of course, every environment is different by considering the countries, but what's gonna be kind of public or is there gonna be any public perception issues? Are people gonna say not in my backyard, that issue? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so certainly that's all the way through CCS's 20-year history, really. There have been public concerns about it because it's a new activity. People don't know about it. They don't know what's going on. It's doing something subsurface they can't see. And so for every CCS project, there's a big public engagement and communication activity as part of that. Many have been very successful. The 50 projects now operating that the Global CCS Institute show us have all been successful in engaging the public. Some projects have been stopped. The famous one was Barendrecht in the Netherlands. They had a lot of industrial activity in that location, and the public outreach was done quite poorly by everyone's judgment, and the public stopped that project going ahead. And I believe that in South Dakota, there's just been something about a CO2 pipeline being stopped as well. So it's an area for active engagement, but we see this with every energy technology. Where I live in Oxford in the UK, there's great public concern about solar farms. I think they're quite good, but a lot of people don't like them. Wind farms onshore, people don't like those, but wind is good, solar's good. We need all the low carbon technologies. So it's an area of constantly active engagement. And under the last administration, for the DOE's every project, am I allowed to say this acronym? Am I allowed to say DEI?
Yes, you can say that.
Had a DEI part, which was very much about engaging the local communities and getting them involved in making some benefit for the local communities, job creation and just transition and all these terms being built into all the DOE projects is a good thing. I don't know what's going to happen now that those aspects have been taken out of the projects. But in general, that was an example of best practice that others do around the world as well.
More questions?
Thank you for nice talk. I don't understand the economics behind your Northern Lights project. What it seems to transporting the CO2 to some other place by ship would be expensive.
So in general, ship transport of anything is actually per ton of unit goods moved is relatively cheap, means of moving goods around the world. It works here. Pipelines work from fixed point to fixed point, but after a certain distance, they become more expensive. Ships are lower cost for longer distances, and there's the flexibility in there. The first phase of that project, the construction of what you saw in the photographs, most of that has been funded by the Norwegian government, the receiving facilities. The joint venture companies, which is Shell, Equinor and Total, in my understanding, have paid for the ships to be built. There's 2 ships built now. The phase 2 of that project is the expansion from 1.5 million tonnes a year now, its capacity, to 5 million tonnes a year. Just last week, the joint venture company made that financial investment decision to go to the expansion. And there's no Norwegian government money going into that. That's going to be completely funded by the commercial contracts of CO2 sources paying for the CO2 storage as a service. So somewhere in that. And then the costs aren't transparent, but that's the outcomes of those decisions indicate that it does work with the government subsidy at the start for the initial infrastructure.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask your thoughts on the effectiveness of direct carbon capture from the atmosphere versus on like a power plant or a factory.
So there's a principle there, because direct air capture is getting a lot of attention, but you really should only use that for the emissions you can't reduce by other means. So you should stop emitting CO2 first, and then what you can't stop being emitted, then use direct air capture for. And that's sort of how it works in the climate models that you'll see in the IPCC and so on. And then the other thing with direct air capture, they do use energy to run those, and you've got to have low carbon energy, electricity going into those. So they are, the companies developing those are looking at solar, wind and small modular nuclear reactors to power them. If you take energy off a grid that's powered by fossil plant, then that's not good. So that's my thought, or the general thoughts on direct air capture. But I welcome the energy companies, the oil companies investing in it. They've got the money. Let them bring down the costs by building the pilot ones, the demonstration ones, because we're going to need it in the future because we're not reducing emissions enough at the moment. So I'm very happy with those demonstration projects going ahead in different places, and I hope that they can continue to get US government support for the ones here in the US.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you everyone for your questions, and let's give Tim another round of applause.